So there are three subatomic particles, or three different types of subatomic particles in the atom. We have protons, which have a positive charge, neutrons with no charge because they're neutral, and electrons. And electrons are negative charges. Now, when you have atoms of the same element with the same number of protons but different number of electrons, you're going to have something that is known as ions. So ions, they can have positive or negative charges depending on what's happening to the number of electrons. If the number of electrons in an atom is decreasing, now you're going to have more protons than electrons, because when an atom is neutral, it contains the same number of protons and electrons. So if the number of electrons is going down, now you're going to have more positive charge, which means that you're going to have an overall charge that is positive because your number of protons is higher than the number of electrons. On the other hand, if you have ions with a negative charge, what that means is now you have an atom which contains more electrons than protons, which means that that atom is gaining electrons. So your number of electrons is going to be higher than the number of protons, which is going to give you something with an overall charge that it's a negative number. So an atom that is losing electrons is going to have a positive charge, and they are known as cation. And an atom that is gaining electrons, they're going to have a negative charge because now they have more electrons than protons, and they are called an ion. So on this side, the number of protons is higher than the number of electrons. And then on this side, the number of protons is now smaller than the number of electrons. If you start with a neutral atom, which means that you don't have an overall charge, you have the same number of positive charges, which are your protons, and negative charges, which are your electrons. But when the number of electrons changes, you're going to form ions, and depending on what's happening to the number of electrons, you can have ions with a positive charge when the atom is losing electrons, or you can have ions with negative charges when the ions are gaining electrons. So if you check the periodic table, lithium, element number 3, if your atomic number is 3, that means that it contains 3 protons. So the number of protons for lithium, as it is in the periodic table, no overall charge, it's 3, equal to the atomic number. Now, the number of electrons for lithium, as it is in the periodic table, no overall charge, it means that you have the same number of protons and electrons. The ion of lithium is going to look like this here. Lithium, and now you have the symbol, and it's showing a charge equal to positive 1. That positive sign, it's telling you right here, if you have a positive ion, it's losing electrons. Okay? So whenever you have a positive charge on an ion, it means that it's losing electrons. And then that number is telling you how many electrons lithium plus 1 it's losing. So lithium, when it's neutral, you have the same number of protons and electrons. So when it's lithium plus 1, it's losing 1 electron, which means that now lithium plus 1 it still contains the same number of protons, because for you to have ions, the number of protons is not changing. The number of protons will never change in a chemical process. It's what gives you the element, the identity. So the number of protons is not changing. What is different in your ions is the number of electrons. So since lithium is losing 1 electron, it goes from the original 3 electrons to 2 electrons now. So if I use positive and negative sign to represent your protons and your electrons, we'll see that each proton, I can use a positive sign to represent each proton. So I have 1, 2, 3 protons, which means that I have 3 positive signs. And then number of electrons, it's each electron, it's represented by a negative charge. So I have 3 positive charges, 3 negative charges, and they will cancel out. Plus 3 plus negative 3, that gives you a neutral charge of 0, no overall charge, because they cancel out. When you have lithium plus 1, now you still have your 3 protons, that's not changing. But lithium plus 1, it's losing 1 electron, and now you have only 2 electrons, not 3. So when you check your charges here, if you add 3 positive charges plus 2 negative charges, that will give you an overall number that is positive 1, which is the charge of lithium because it's losing 1 electron. So now 2 of your protons are canceling out with 2 of your electrons, but then you have 1 proton here with no electron to cancel that charge, which means that that proton represents the charge that you have in your ion. You have a positive 1 charge because that proton has no electron to cancel that positive charge with. Now nitrogen in the periodic table has an atomic number equal to 7, which means that your number of protons for nitrogen will be 7. As it is neutral in the periodic table, you have the same number of protons and electrons. When you have the ion of nitrogen is going to look like this one here. Nitrogen minus 3 with a negative charge. So if you refer to the diagram here, when you have a negative charge, that represents an atom that is gaining electrons, forming an ion. So now your number of electrons is higher than the number of protons. So the negative sign for nitrogen means that it's gaining, and the number is telling you how many electrons. How many electrons the nitrogen atom is gaining to become nitrogen minus 3. The number of protons is not changing because for you to have ions, the number of protons is not changing, just the number of electrons. So you still have your 7 protons, but now the ion of nitrogen, it's gaining 3 electrons, which means that your number of electrons now goes from your original 7 to 10 because you have 3 extra electrons. You're going to have a higher number of electrons than protons, and that's why you have an overall charge that it's a negative. Positive 7 plus 10 negatives, that will give you minus 3, which is the excess number of electrons that you have in the ion of nitrogen. So you can complete the following statements here later, and I'm going to do just one of these ones, and you can complete the other ones later. For you to find the number of protons and electrons, you have to use your periodic table. And let's do the first one here, iron. Iron, it's a transition metal, which means that it's located in the middle of the periodic table. It's right there. Element number 26. Atomic number 26 means that you have 26 protons because your atomic number gives you the identity of the element, and that identity tells you how many protons you have. So iron from the periodic table contains 26 protons. Now what you have, you're counting number of protons and electrons for the ion of iron. If it's just the element of iron, you're going to have the same number of protons and electrons because it will be neutral, the same number of positive and negative charges. But since this is the ion of iron, you have a positive charge, which means that that atom of iron lost 3 electrons. Okay? So the positive means that it's losing, and then your number is telling you how many. So iron plus 3 is not going to contain 26 electrons because it's losing 3 of those electrons to become iron plus 3. So it goes from 26 to 23 electrons.